I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth and the white light of the hospital room piercing my vision. There was a weight on my chest that wasn't just from the surgery. It was the weight of realizing for a second your own fragility. I remember the silence broken by the hurried steps of the corridor and how the machine next to me marked a regular rhythm that seemed to say, "Breathe. Stay." I opened my eyes and saw hands that I recognized all too much. My ex-wife with her face painted with fake condolence, and my mother-in-law next to her, with those calculating eyes that I knew from when we still signed papers together. They didn't come with flowers or questions about my health. They came with a hurry in their eyes, with an urgency that smelled of numbers, figures, shortcuts. I heard, as in a corner of my conscience, the demand, "Tell us the password to your safe. We need to access the accounts now." The sentence fell into my room as if it were a sentence. I felt something deep move in me, not fear, not exactly. Something I'd only felt on rare mornings of victory on the board of directors. Clarity. I, who had built from scratch one of the largest banks in the United States, who knew the weight of decisions and the tricks of power, was vulnerable there, and the world around me showed its real face. I looked at them and said nothing. I kept quiet. Not out of weakness, but out of control. There were, a few hours before, cliches and screens that I couldn't ignore. Transfers that didn't match, signatures that seemed to have been forged, lawyers whispering plans as if I were already defeated. I had seen the trail of betrayal. Waited. Lying down, listening to machines and counting, I let my patience be a weapon. Because when someone tries to take what's yours while you're breathing hard, the response demands precision, not noise. They spoke of inheritance before any compassion, as if illness were an inconvenient detail on the way to their goals. My ex disguised her haste with gentle phrases. "Of course it's for your good, we need to organize everything." I could see in his hands the gestures of someone who turns and turns contracts with the same naturalness with which he turns the page of a book. My mother-in-law, always as correct as it was convenient, led the requests as if she had an acquired right to my digital keys. I remembered the years of construction, sleepless nights, decisions that stirred markets, convictions that were overturned and erected as milestones in my path. I thought of my family, the employees who trusted me, the men and women of the bank who had firm and ethical leadership. The humiliation they tried to impose there in that room was not only mine. It was an attempt to tear away from me the stamp that I put on everything I built. And then came the doctor, a man of calm presence, whom I had seen only a few times in my life, and yet who spoke with the firmness of one who understands processes and limits. He came in, inspected the papers they were carrying, looked at me as if asking for permission, and unhurriedly stated something that seemed small, but cut through their plan like a blade. "Sir, as per your direction, any financial access will only be released at the court meeting you requested." The phrase was thrown and the masks began to fall. The color was gone from their faces like paint washed away by rain. I smiled, a restrained smile, one that didn't need to be displayed. There at that moment had begun the public humiliation that would transform their greed into what it really was, a miscalculated crime. In the days that followed, the hospital scene became just the prologue. While I was recovering, I shut myself up in observation. I invited my best lawyers, my most loyal advisors, and began a discreet, almost artisanal investigation, checking logs, forensically analyzing transfers, tracking communications. Every click, every signature, every movement that my former relationships tried to disguise appeared like a thread of a broken fabric. I saw the pattern: attempts to move assets to intermediary accounts, contracts with near-perfect signatures, lawyers who paired with small, vile interests. It was an obvious underworld when you look closely, and I was looking. The bank, which I ran with firmness and vision, needed a response that was equivalent to crime, proportionate and authoritative. I could have screamed on social media, I could have made a private scandal with photos and leaks. But the lesson I've learned from years in the market is that noise often benefits the offender. Silence with strategy hurts more deeply. I planned an elegant institutional response. I prepared a board conference with transmission to the entire corporation and the presence of lawyers and independent auditors. It was the perfect stage: light, facts, evidence, and faces. And in the center I recovered, serene, ready to show off what I had discovered. He knew that the greatest humiliation for those who risk the life of another would be to see their intentions exposed under the seal of legality, where there is no room for emotional interpretations. only for concrete evidence. The day of the meeting arrived. I walked into the boardroom with the feeling that years were compressed into minutes. I walked to the pulpit and saw eyes fixed on me. Counselors, lawyers, department executives, some journalists who would cover the institutional communique. My ex and my mother-in-law did not know that the broadcast would go through channels that reached not only the board, but also regional executives and independent auditors. They believed that if they were in a hurry, they could solve everything in silence. They didn't count on my decision to turn their haste into a stage. I opened the presentation and calmly began to expose the facts. Atypical transfers, disputed signatures, contracts that emerged at strange times. Each slide was accompanied by documents, dates, electronic communication records. I showed forensic reports that demonstrated attempts to hide traces. The room was freezing. He saw their hands tremble in photos captured at the time of the exhibition. My ex tried to explain, tried to articulate a version, but everything sounded shallow when I pulled the thread to the knot. Recordings, emails, receipts. The humiliation that had visited us in the hospital now had a name and proof. And it wasn't just their humiliation. It was the enclosure of their certainties. The audience watched with the same emotion that one has when seeing a well-staged play. Surprise, repudiation, astonishment. It was insolence that justice began to whisper. The will to do justice has become a public act of correction. The transfers were reversed by court order. Attempts to register assets in the name of third parties were barred. The bank, whose reputation is a cornerstone of my work, released an institutional note announcing the opening of civil and criminal proceedings. My exes and mother-in-law saw in the face of an entire ecosystem that I had helped to build that their reckless steps had a price. What I wanted most was not to break lives. It was to restore order and show that no one feeds on the vulnerability of others with impunity. On that night when everything unfolded, I saw looks that had previously strayed my name see reality with painful clarity. The revenge I carried out was elegant because it was just, devastating because it was definitive, and exemplary because it made it clear that those who try to steal the life of another, while that other breathes, will encounter resistance that does not depend on brute force but on law, order, and strategic patience. I didn't need to scream. I let the facts make the noise that the truth always makes when it is well presented. When everything became clear and the auditors confirmed each fraud attempt, I realized the scope of what had happened. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was an internal, public message about boundaries and respect. I received messages from employees who said they felt ashamed for not having noticed it before. I received calls from partners who thanked me for my firm stance. And quieter, I felt a peace that comes from those who know they did the right thing. My ex and mother-in-law faced legal consequences commensurate with their actions. It didn't bring me malicious pleasure. It brought a sense of restored justice. In the tangle of contracts and emotions, there was, for me, a greater lesson. Never underestimate the power of strategic silence and preparation. I was silent in the ICU, but inside me something screamed. They spoke as if I were invisible. I stopped being a victim. I became an observer. And when it was time, I let the court and the truth speak for me. If it were you, what would you do in the face of a betrayal so close to a hospital bed? Would you react with noise and anger? Or would you make silence a weapon and the law your final response? I woke up for the second day with the feeling that something had changed inside me. It wasn't just physical strength that needed to come back. It was the moral clarity that I'd long left buried under decisions and compromises. As the doctors monitored my pulse and adjusted medication, I began to notice details that had previously been voiceless. The misplaced interaction between the receptionist and a familiar lawyer, the uncomfortable expression of a director who passed by without greeting, the emails that popped up on my phone with vague topics. I asked those who visited me for silence, and, between one sip of water and another, I began to mentally draw the next step. It was not enough to punish. It was necessary to seal the doors that allowed the attempted robbery. I called my main legal officer by video. In a few hours, he was by my side with the forensic report already in hand. We show every transfer, every signature, every attempt to cloak it with a wealth of records. What was once chaos has become an accurate map of actions and culprits. We then set up three fronts: judicial to block and recover the assets, institutional to protect the bank's reputation and inform stakeholders with the least possible margin of damage, and personal to carefully expose those involved and preserve those who truly somehow depended on my leadership. To do this by force with scandal would be to give the stage to feeling. To do this coldly with strategy would be to give back to those who tried to destroy me the feeling of powerlessness they deserved. While my legal team was in place to take emergency measures, I re-established contact with a few people I trusted at the bank: the chief compliance officer, the head of cybersecurity, and an external auditor who had worked with me in previous crises. Each was given clear instructions: zero unauthorized leaks, preservation of digital chains of custody, full audit of internal communications. I also asked them to avoid hasty public decisions. The press, I knew, would love to turn it into a spectacle. That is why we determined that any communique would only come out after we had a dossier that withstood legal and media scrutiny. The humiliation, if it were imposed, would be applied by those in authority: the court, the auditors, the bank's own governance, and not by gossip that makes headlines and forgets the people involved. At the same time, I have quietly ordered an investigation of the lawyers who appeared in the suspicious communications. The connection between my ex and a certain office was not accidental. There were confluences of interest that deserved not only exposure but also professional accountability. The feeling of seeing each piece of the puzzle fit together was bittersweet. I felt betrayal, yes, but also a certainty that the architecture of my work would respond to the height. In the following days, I started to recover physically, but mentally I worked with intensity. There was one element that disturbed me more than obvious greed: the normalcy with which some people accepted the idea of stepping over me when I was vulnerable. This said a lot about how ambition can anesthetize bonds. I have called a few people together for private conversations, some to listen, some to confront, always maintaining the posture of a leader who knows his limits and who, above all, protects his organization. I didn't look for skirmishes. He was looking for posture. One of the most uncomfortable encounters took place in my office when I received a trusted director who, when looking at me, could not maintain the narrative of surprise that the facts demanded. There were contradictions in his explanations, small details that didn't add up. I did not accuse him there. I offered him the chance to explain, to take a stand. His reaction, marked by a long silence, said more than any justification could. That conversation was not to humiliate, it was to measure character. And character, when pressed, shows its cracks. Meanwhile, my opponents, my ex and my mother-in-law, breathed visible anxiety. In the cold coverage of the lawsuits, what scared them most was not the shadow of justice, but the public exposure. Audits, directors, shareholders, people who could lose confidence in the bank because of internal scandals. They tried to sow defenses that seemed shallow in the face of the evidence. I saw impulsive emails, requests for documents that should have been filed, phone calls cut off at the wrong time, small errors that accumulated like snow that announces avalanches. The trust that some people placed in his versions crumbled when confronted with technical records and learned testimonies. In silence, I continued to write down their every action, every conversation, as if collecting evidence of a crime that will be judged by those who understand these things. The system, the magnitude of the betrayal made everything clearer. There were motives that went beyond financial gain. Old comings, hidden grudges, personal disputes turning into looting attempts. And this taught me that, in business and in the family, there are wounds that never heal if you don't work with truth and limits. As the legal measures were consolidated, I prepared the presentation I would make at the bank's conference. It would not be a revenge play. It would be an exercise in transparency. I wanted my employees to understand not only what had happened, but also how the bank reacted in the face of internal affronts. I asked the auditors to format each piece of evidence so that it was understandable to non-technical people, without losing accuracy. At the same time, I coordinated with the communication teams the preparation of a formal note to be distributed after the meeting, containing the measures already taken. There was a legitimate concern about the noise in the markets, and this required an impeccable governance stance. In my heart, however, I was waiting for a more personal moment. I wanted to look into the eyes of my opponents in the meeting, to see the reflection of their surprise and at the same time to maintain the composure that has always characterized me. The justice I sought was not a spectacle of humiliation. It was a restoration of order. And yet there was something visceral that pulled me. A need to close a chapter with the force of truth. On the eve of the conference, when the air was already smelling of paper and coffee, I received a message I didn't expect. A cybersecurity alert pointing to coordinated attempts to access our regional servers that very morning. Someone has quietly tried to plant a distraction, a fake leak, or an attempt to discredit the auditors. The alert triggered a protocol. The security team acted quickly. I understood clearly that not only my exes and my mother-in-law were willing to risk everything. There was someone in the vicinity who would try to sabotage the corrective action. I felt the air change. The plot was bigger than I had imagined. And so, with my heart racing, I realized that what came next would require not only evidence and laws, but absolute vigilance and even greater patience. The microclimax was set. I had the evidence, but now I needed to ensure that the truth reached its destination intact. To the board, to the shareholders, to the justice system, without opposing forces altering course. The next step would be to face in public not only the women who tried to use me, but also those who, from the shadows, tried to erase my tracks. And when the morning of the meeting came, nothing, neither cheating nor fear, could make me back down. I entered the conference room with a calm that came from the conviction of someone who had already been through greater storms. It wasn't false serenity. It was the fruit of hours of painstaking work while my body was still recovering. The lights in the room were set to focus. The cameras were ready, and I saw on the faces of some counselors a mixture of surprise and anticipation. There were always those who doubted that someone who had been through an emergency could keep a steady hand. But I knew that true strength reveals itself when the pressure increases. I began by presenting the facts with the coolness that the occasion demanded. Timelines, transfer logs, signature comparisons, access logs, and forensic reports. Each slide had a digital trail, and each trail led to names, accounts, and cloaking attempts. The logic was simple and unforgiving. As I spoke, I could see the reactions. Board members staring from one to the other, lawyers biting their lips, executives who had hitherto avoided any direct contact with me now stared at the screens. My ex and mother-in-law were present. They were not part of the technical auditorium, but were invited by formality. And there, in front of everyone, their versions began to crumble. When I presented their recordings that showed instructions and arranged conversations, the air in the room changed. There were no screams, just the dry sound of papers being picked up, and their expressions turned from control to helplessness. The defense tried to articulate arguments, sought explanations that sounded shallow in the face of the technical evidence. It was like trying to cover the sun with the palm of your hand. Useless. I asked the independent auditors to read their findings aloud, and they did so with the neutrality that only numbers and facts allow. Justice began there, not with a hammer, but with the clarity of data that leaves no room for emotional versions. I also asked the compliance and security teams to take immediate action, blocking accounts, reversing suspicious transfers, calling the competent authorities. Everything was executed with surgical precision. In the end, I announced the opening of civil and criminal proceedings, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a demand for responsibility. As it finished, I looked at the audience and saw something I had rarely seen: a heavy silence, full of recognition, not only of my pain, but of the correction needed. I left the room with a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and tiredness. In the hours that followed, their percussion was controlled by the institutional note we had prepared, a clear communication to shareholders, customers, and the market, showing that the bank had reacted with governance and respect for the law. I didn't want to turn that into a media spectacle. Reputation is built on consistent actions, not passing noise. The consequences came in a predictable and fair way: disciplinary measures, professional investigations against lawyers involved, and most significantly, the reversal of financial transactions that tried to appropriate what was mine. I did not celebrate as someone who savors the defeat of others. I felt rather the restoration of an infringed order. Over the next few weeks, I received messages of support from employees, partners, and even customers who, surprised, recognized the importance of leadership that protects not only their assets, but the integrity of an entire institution. And within me, there was a silent reconciliation. I learned that vulnerability is not an invitation to debauchery, and that the most devastating response to a planned betrayal is not public derision, but their relentless application of law and truth. As I recovered, I promised myself and the bank that we would tighten controls, that governance would become stricter, and that no one, no matter how close, would have the leeway to try something like this again. The lesson was hard, personal, and institutional, and when the curtains fell, I realized that the revenge I chose was the one that most preserved my dignity, the one that transformed intimate aggression into transparent justice, making it clear that those who try to steal the life of another will find behind the apparent silence a firm and intransigent strategy.